And hello. Clickety-clack, clickety-clacks. Here we are. Just barely on the button. Troubles in Paradise, Methodology of Creationism, RJ's Evolution Hour, typewriters, analog clocks, logo. Yay! TortuganWordPress.com. If you don't have that in your setup, why not? That's what it's there for. Okay, we can stop sharing on that and start off on the show. We've got a gem-packed collection of material today going. As usual, I'm continuing the analysis of Contested Bones, the Creationist book by Rupe-Sanford. They're still in the Australopithecus Sediba thing, which is fresh on both Jackson and ours mind because of the stuff that we've been studying in relation to Parentology and how the creationists waffle around it. For those of you not familiar on the skivvy, Sediba is one of those little catch-all things in the middle of the zone between the Australopithecines and the earliest of Homo sapiens, or the Homo genus, Homo erectus and that crowd. And there's not a huge number of fossils, although Sediba is a really impressive one. And although it doesn't have all the bones, it has some of the most relevant bones. One of the particular sections that I found absolutely hilarious, and Jackson will probably have to smile at this, is on the Sediba structure. It says, the researchers acknowledge that Sediba's inferred ability to walk upright was, quote, based primarily, unquote, on the hip bone and lower limb, as well as the commingled vertebrae, which we discussed previously, and, quote, to a lesser extent on the pedal, bracketed partial foot and ankle bones morphology of MH2. In other words, they're basing the idea of bipedality on the evidence that pertains to things walking bipedally. What a weird idea that is. So
yes,
what
how
it
bizarre.
boils down to, is that I wish I could have put the link up to Bean and Rock's piece that Contested Bones relies on. Bean and Rock are two paleoanthropologists who have some quibbles with the Sediba fossils. And one thing they presented at an anthropological conference back in 2014 suggested that maybe one of the bones was actually not from the same genus as the Sediba one. And Rupe-Sanford immediately jump on that. And aha, see, we've got the smoking guns. Well, that's 2014, and I can't find any indication that anybody since 2014 has been really playing that card, including Bean and Rack. They haven't done any further works on the subject, and I can't find any indication that anybody, even in the obviously in the Berger camp, that is the main group that's exploring Sediba, but in any of the others, you'd think that this would have been really touted up, and it would have been a paper in the Journal of Anthropology and all that, not just a side paper. That's a dead giveaway that maybe things are not quite as it appears to be. So I put some links up to what I could get links to, because remember, I always want to have stuff that you can look at fully, not just little teeny excerpts. And there were a couple general articles that Rupe cited from Kate Wong and one of the other authors, I think, at New Scientist, and then a couple technical papers that he drew on, one of which had a title that, even though the title was in the note, this should have been a dead giveaway. It's about the taxonomical status of A. Sediba, which is that it is, in fact, a specific taxon. It shouldn't be lumped in with anything else. It's its own little group. And therefore, the putative argument that there's more than one taxon here, which is YEC and Rack and Bean's argument, really isn't flying far with the people in this area. So I put those links up on that, and it'll still be an ongoing stuff to see what's going on in terms of the spreadsheet and bibliography that I'm constructing. It's still sticking pretty much to form, less than 2 sources per page. 40% of it is authority quoted, and almost half of their references to technical literature are missing or suppressing information that doesn't fit their argument. It's a standard procedure. Once they hit that level, it's been pretty stable all the way down the line. Needless to say, they're not even alluding to any of the creationist model, and that's what's so pesky about Rupe-Sanford, because it's hide the ball. They never really tell us too much about what they think happened, and more importantly, never ever lay out criteria for if there were an actual group that was in between Australopithecines and humans, what would they look like and what features would they have? And absolutely no anti-evolutionist ever does that, not just in this instance, but in any instance that I've ever been able to find. And I'm sure that Jackson, in his reading of the various creationists for his studies and his videos and the book that we're doing, has found exactly the same thing, that you can never find out what they would accept because their brains don't ever think about that, ever. Literally no counterexample in 150 years of anti-evolutionism. I call that a pattern. So that's we'll probably spend a lot more time talking about stuff other than that. I put a link up to the marathon that scientist Mel did over the weekend for her website, that she was doing a benefit for somebody, and she put the links up on all of that. But anyway, during the course of this second movie night that we had, at the end of it, which was talking about a bunch of Kent Hovind videos, Mel just jumped in and called up the phone line to Kent Hovind on the Q&A and got him on the line. And she had the sweetest little conversation that just went on and on, where she was asking him questions in very discreet, well-phrased ways so that he wouldn't get his antennas up thinking, uh-oh, I'm talking to some evolutionist. And he was just dithering on. You could not find a more perfect example of all that's wrong with Kent Hovind in his superficiality. She would bring up subject matters like what obviously was referring to the big Permian mass extinction, and no bells and whistles were going off in Kent's brain as to what she was talking about. And then even down to the point of Kent didn't seem to know that Habitat for Humanity is a religious group of people doing good, building houses for people. It's not like a government program. And so this was an indication of just how limited and parochial Kent Hovind's culture camp conservative philosophical position is. It's just hilariously loony. So anyway, the whole video was fun to watch, and certainly the section, I put the link up there that Mel put up, that is also a useful illustration of how you can ask questions of creationists in a very non-confrontational way and still glean huge amounts of information. I know the audience were positively chomping at the bit to ask questions. Oh, hi, Beej and Look a Pig. We got some people in there. Hi, gang. I apologize deeply for being slow on the mark here. I've had umpteen balls in the air because I'm going over to my niece's for Christmas, and I'm leaving early. I'm checking the Snoqualmie Pass to make sure that everything is still open on there, making sure that everything is organized, and then packing up stuff, and then working on a book with Jackson, and doing my novel and the various chapters, and suddenly realized I had this weird tendency, as I write the story, I'll forget what I've called somebody, and I may change their name without realizing it. And it turned out I was using two different names for the same character, the last name later in the book than the other. And then when I checked back on it, because I made a big deal eventually about the little coat of arms that they were using, and I realized, uh-oh, I got to make sure that the name matches up. So I did a little checking on that. So I have many balls in the air going, and we have to do all the things we do. So Jackson, we hate to just see you in there with a muted microphone. Come on the screen and let's talk about what we've been doing on The Rocks Are Still There.
Well, currently you're proofing the kinds chapter, which should be the refutation of baraminology, and I'm proofing the radiometric chapter, looking at your working on isochrons and things like that. And I actually went down a rabbit hole and found some really interesting information that I even tossed over to Aaron Ra, because one of Kent Hovind's favorite lines is, farmers rely on evolution not happening, you know, for cows and crops and all this other stuff, even though Kent Hovind knows how artificial selection works and all this. But the interesting thing is, I found out RJ makes a note to C3 plants. C3 carbon fixation is part of the photosynthesis. And so there are different types of this process where they convert atmospheric carbon dioxide to a different carbon compound, whether it's the three carbon or malate, which is 4 carbon or whatever. And so it turns out that the C4 process is actually more efficient than the C3 process. So geneticists are actually trying to get the C3 plants to evolve into C4 plants, so because they're more efficient. So you could make
and I think they're differentially reacting to climate change. So
Yeah.
the people, when they are talking about how plants are going to respond to climate, if they're a C3 plant, they react differently than if they're a C4 plant. I brought it up because it relates to selectively what kind of isotopes get shown up in particular organisms in relation to radiocarbon dating. And I love the fact that you picked up on the other aspect of it and are running further. And so we both of do the same thing. Like on the chapter that you wrote on the baraminology matter, you were really cutting one of the baraminologists that was cited by I think was it Leitner or someone else on there, the kinds. You had a paragraph quote that you quoted from them, and you gave them too much slack by not exploring their source base. So I'm actually looking up the primary sources that they were drawing on in their baraminology papers, and ooh, it's juicy. Oh boy, they're missing the things.
That was probably determining the arc kinds, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. It was on Brophy and that crowd, and that you had done a little bit on the salamander side, but the next one that was on the Galliformes birds, it turned out to be really juicy when I looked up the original source material. That all they were doing not only was confirming the evolutionary relationships, but they jumped the terms. You didn't realize that he switched the terms in the middle. He's talking about a holobaramin at one point, and then suddenly it's monobaramin. Well, those are very different, because a holobaramin is a created kind. A monobaramin is an evolved subset of a hypothetical created kind. And suddenly they're backpedaling on that. No, that was a delicious
at the end of the chapter, isn't it?
Beach asked about Sedibas are the little people. No, those are the hobbits. Those are the Floriensis bunch that are actually much later on down the road. It's still unclear whether those are some weird branch of Homo erectus or whether there's some really remnant group of wandering Australopithecine cousin. That's the least likely of them. The ones that are more recent papers tend to think about the fact that we're talking about the fact that they're on an isolated island, so they're probably, in air quotes, probably a dwarf form of a Homo erectus branch, because they're the ones that spread like mad out of Africa and work their way down. And it's still a matter of getting the chronology out and how long they've survived there. And of course, new blips go on the same. Sediba, I think, is somewhat taller, although all the Australopithecines are fairly short.
Yeah.
What's so distinctive about Homo erectus is the jump up to more normal, typical human height level. And partly this is argued because of the habitat that they were in. They were in a more savanna climate, wandering around low surface area to where a tall frame that's getting less sunlight coming down on them works better. And they're still plugging away on all this stuff. Anyway,
that was kind of, the book Restless Creatures by Wilkinson, I think was his name. It's about the evolution of like movement and motion in different groups of animals and organisms. It's a really interesting book. Yeah, Matt Wilkinson, I think is his name. Oh.
Yeah, in fact, when you find out about a lot of things, one of the I think I alluded to it in Slam Dunk, but I'm just going on my memory here about the one paper that talked about the constraints on the other vertebral structure on mammals, that when you are a runner, you have a bunch of constraints because of the way the ribs hang off of it and all of that, that it tends to be fairly conserved. So there's a constraint as to why that doesn't change much in mammals, because of the way that the anatomy all fits together. It's almost like things have evolved constraints that generate why things look the way they do, like duh. Whoa. And that's why Kent Hovind's argument that you can't tell anything about a fossil from it. Oh gosh, that's wrong. It's amazing how much you can tell about the fossil, especially if you know it in context.
Yeah, I've devoted an entire series of videos on my channel to what you can learn about from fossils. It's my paleontology series. It's like 6 or 7 videos about what you can learn from fossils.
And not merely the individual fossil, and the taphonomic context in which it's found, which will tell you about isotope balances and what plants were available because of pollen grains. You could find out what's absent from there. You want to have examples of, sometimes you only have like a tooth to go on, but sometimes you have a fuller skeleton. In other areas, the absence of things can be just as significant as other things can. And then you want to know what cousins are around and what the biogeographical distribution of it is. And then you can also bring in geological data, so you can work out tectonics, you can work out where mountain ranges are, you can work out where floodplains are, you can work out how wind patterns are occurring and how oceanic currents are changing the dynamics of why the plants are in this location rather than that. There's a huge amount of technical literature on this subject. Yep. And what is monotonous is, I bet you have never found a creationist that has ever read anything in that area.
Oh, hey, no, I was actually just talking to a creationist, I think just yesterday, who was blowing his foot off about taphonomy. It was just silly. Yeah, they don't.
Yeah, it's a pretty gruesome little operation on there. Another thing that I've been doing, thanks to the prodding of Apologia and SciStrike and all that, was checking out my Patreon system again. Either I had a brain fart, or the menus were literally different when I set up my Patreon account ways back. And I found that there were new options and things that were not there that I don't remember before. Anyway, I did some scanning and checking around, and so I think, cross fingers, that the actual money from the Patreon account may start funneling downstream in January. So at that point, and Paul had joined the parade. He'll be reading his name off when I do the plug in about 5 or 10 minutes. But yeah, the fascinating thing, and one of the big methods lessons that I want everybody to learn, and we've learned that so much from our own writing of this book, is that cooperative interactions between people of varying expertise always helps. And never trust a secondary source, no matter what it is. That if you can't track it to a primary source data field and then examine that primary source data field, you should be wary of it. And so even if somebody is kind of a pundit, if you look at really reliable commentators like Carl Zimmer or Brian Naish, you'll find that they are chock-a-block with references. Even on YouTube, this is another thing that I'm really encouraging people to do. It is unconscionable to have a YouTube video on a technical subject that doesn't put up direct links in the video description to the major points that you're bringing up, so everybody can follow up on it on their own. You don't have to go hunting up the thing and trying to find out what all the reference. You can often do that. I've gone through videos that are totally source free, but they talk about the taxa, they talk about periods, and I'm able to Google search the subject matter and bring up the technical papers. But why the hell isn't that in the links? That saves you time. And so I try to do the same thing with my material, that if I'm going to be discussing specific material, I want you to be able to, if you feel like doing the follow-up, you can do it quick. And it's not something where you have to waste time hunting around for it. And then you can use that time more productively by following up on the follow-up, and that speeds up the process enormously. So let's make it a New Year's resolution. Damn it, you're going to put sources in your damn videos, okay?
It's really great when creationists put up sources to their arguments also, because that allows you to go see what they're looking at. Like the example with the Leitner paper that says, what is it? Morphology does not necessarily correlate with genetics, or something like that. And it's like, what?
Oh yeah, and the other hilarious one in that thing was that where they were talking about the discordance in their baromenological studies between the hybridization data and the morphological data, which all that was doing. If you looked at it from an evolutionary point of view, you're going like, duh. Hybridization is a phenomenon that relates to speciation events, whereas morphology is a much longer trend and is not in and of itself a speciation process, although that plays a part in it. So as you're seeing more and more morphological disparity, those are going to be over time as things are gradually diverging from their. The hybridization issue is relating to when they branched off as a species. And so you've got this strange disconnect between that they're trying to apply things at one level or another, and it's never making sense, because they're not using the correct model, which is an evolutionary one. Then it makes sense.
You saw when, was it Wise pointed out that you can't use just the genetic data, you have to look at it holistically?
Yeah, and then not.
Yeah, and then not.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to bring that up, then jolly well do it. And of course, we're just terrible people, you and I, Jackson, because we keep on asking the creationists to actually discuss data and explain things. Isn't that terrible?
Yeah, I mean, even in the paper that they were referencing, they were saying there is strong genetic similarities among humans and all the other great apes. And they're like, yeah, it exists, but we're going to ignore that because
We're going to
and they
pretend it
literally
doesn't
say
mean
we're
what it
going to
wants to
ignore that.
be. Yeah, and so what you see, and I see this over and over again in that Contested Bones book, but in every anti-evolutionist one, is what they have is this desire for the type, the typology. They want the separate thing. And human beings, of course, if you're a doctrinal creationist, human beings have got to be a separate kind. No ifs, no ands, no buts about it. Never, ever, 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 ever can they be anything other than just the kind. But the rest, they're flowing all over the place, running up and down between species and genera and families and orders and classes and wandering all back and forth. Although it's kind of hard to find many creationists that are willing to go so far as to argue that phyla are created kinds, even in some rare cases. Although they might get away with it, maybe, you know, with chinorhynchs or something like that. You know, something if they're wiggly. Yeah, if they're, but they tend not to think about most of those. So you get this archetypal stuff, and when you filter downstream, that's why a knowledge of the background taxa is really important if you're going to be trampling on the Cambrian explosion. Because if you don't know what the taxa are in the Cambrian, how they differ from what we know now, and how they relate taxonomically to what they know now, and how they derived all of those things, the creationists can seem as they're tossing off the jargon that they've nicked from Steve Meyer or
standing
from
for truth.
Yeah, or standing for truth. Yeah, yeah. It's I've been trying to get him to pay attention to some of the data and to fact check Sanford, but boy, he just doesn't seem to get that source checking thing. And the point is it's relatively easy to do with Sanford. I was blown away when I finally got a copy of Sanford's book as to how superficial it was at the reference level. His bibliography is a whopping, like, what? I think it's like 8 or 10 pages, something like that, and in big print. I mean, this is you already know how big my bibliographies tend to be.
Oh, our collective bibliography for this is going to be ginormous, even in tiny print.
Yeah, it's expanding each time because I add material and you add material, and I want to make sure everything is as up to date as possible. So that even as it is, we just think we're finished with a chapter, and then suddenly one of us comes along. Oh, new paper, and it's. Yeah, and so this one will be, even though it will be coming out, cross fingers, 2019 at some point, that it will be very, very up to date in terms of the technical literature. So we'll be on the ball on all of this one, and it will be just think evolution slam dunk, but by more than one person and covering all those creationists.
Yeah, I'm very excited for it, and I get more excited whenever we finish a chapter and you upload it into the the finished thing, and so as it compounds, it
is such an exhilarating thing for me because I'm constantly learning things and exploring stuff that I didn't know before, because I'm encountering your take on it that's coming at it from a younger generation, and you're at cutting edge in terms of a lot of the college work that you're doing, and your ability to just rattle off the damn jargon. I am gobsmacked by that because I stumble on those terms and I have to write them down and carefully read them and pronounce them out in my heads and all that. The ability just to rattle those off, I can do that with some things. But with the systematics and all of that, the binomial ones, you just have that, bleh, and I'm just amazed at all of that. But between the two of us, then, we are catching the creationists in such a horrible vice, both in terms of the delicious data field and how mangled their arguments are, how tendentious, how evasive. It's just one thing after another.
You might cry when you see Mike Riddle's chapter on information. It's so threadbare. It's barely even a chapter. It's
and all of these things are ones, if anybody has been following debates that you have with creationists, and if you haven't had debates with creationists, oh, you lucky chap. But at any rate, if you have, you'll be finding masses of the technical information and the issues done in depth in our responses to these things. And nobody has really done this with the answers books before. There's been smatterings of criticism online, but we're basically treading new turf here. And I think that's a good second step after slam dunk, because what you want to do with a work is tread new ground. You want to cut into areas that have not been properly covered before, and do it in such a way that you set a benchmark, boom, and then can move on to the next benchmark. And I think this is going to be a thing. The rocks are still there. Oh, speaking of which, if it is, after all, holiday time, and you still have just a little bit of time left stocking stuffered, so make sure I'll put the link up in here to my website. You can find links to both of my books there, and you can still glom onto them for your science-loving friends. You can get them Evolution Slam Dunk. And for your creationist friends, you can get them Evolution Slam Dunk as a terror prize. For anybody that likes fiction, you can get the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, which is mystery and science fiction, and historical adventure, and electric guns. Don't forget all the little fun stuff. And I'm busy plowing away with Cirrus on the audio books. He just finished up chapter 14. And I've got up to about 29, I think, recorded, and then I still have to go out to the end. So there's about 15 chapters left to do, which I'll be getting to after the holidays are over. And so that'll presumably be up. I would have liked to have gotten that up for the holiday thing, but better late than never. And theoretically, then after that, I'll do an audio book of a Slam Dunk, and then in principle, the audio book then for the second Fogg novel. So anyway, pick up those things. First of all, RJ can use the royalties on the books. And secondly, they're both good books. And the Slammed, as much as I'm fond of Paralogs, it's a delicious little novel. On the import side, Slam Dunk is more important because it's filling up a gap. Question about your book from Look a Pig. What prior knowledge do I need to read? Either one of them, none. Evolution Slam Dunk defines terms and gives you an intro. It's written in, it discusses stuff at a technical level at many points, but you don't need to be technical to follow up on the concepts that I'm describing. Those are just there if you're at a college level and want to track down the detailed technical references on gene duplication, for example. I put those in as a resource. There were some readers that kind of got thrown off because I would have like a paragraph of references that I would be guiding you through in chronological order that you could follow up on. Don't let your eyes glaze over on that. You know, you just jump to the next paragraph and continue the text. So there, in effect, instead of it being a sidebar or a footnote, I just did it in a direct line. But it covers the human story, the people that are involved. If you don't know diddly squat about the creation evolution issue, you'll know most of the main players in the course of the book in terms of both creationism and intelligent design. You'll have a sense of the history because the main chapters cover the treatment of how creationists have avoided the reptile-mammal transition in pretty chronological order. So we start with Duane Gish's bunch and Michael Denton back in the 1980s, and then we move into the intelligent design wing in the 1990s and then into the 21st century. And there's about 20 anti-evolutionists who have tackled the RMT over years, and every single one of them is just ridiculously evasive and bad. There's not a single one of them that's rigorous. Now, on the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, that one is also one where you don't need to know a damn thing. If you've never read any of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, don't worry. I've embedded the entire story inside of the Paralogs so that you will literally get everything and with a twist. So just imagine the original Jules Verne story is, you know, your Academy frame kind of a thing. And then I'm pulling you back to widescreen cinemascope, Panavision, VistaVision, stereophonic sound, big picture in high definition. And so you see what you saw before, but now you realize, oh, that means something completely different. So it's a kind of a Rashomon take of it. There's mysteries and science fiction. And apart from all the made up stuff, like there are no real, spoiler alert, there are no actual atomic powered rocket planes in 1872. Sorry. But other than that, literally all the history is accurate. So San Francisco and Hong Kong and New York City and Florida and all the places are as they were in those particular moments in 1872. And the Great Eastern, you'll get a chance to tour the great ship of the 19th century with some slight modifications. But nevertheless, all of that's real too. So it's a fun historical adventure, all that. So anyway, off onto that. We're about halfway through. Let me put up my shameless plug let me see here. Boop-de-boop. For the patrons, let me get that up to speed. As usual, I am still very, very clumsy and slow on the uptake here. I'm new at this. I'm an old dog and I'm learning new tricks. So I know that people who look on my channel see like no content. And that's because I haven't figured out the technique of putting things in directories yet, and I'm afraid to just jump in and start moving crap around lest I lose a file, or if I keep track of all my URLs and stuff. So if it shifts the URL over, do I need to change it in my master listing? So there's a bunch of things I'm leery to do. And I know it may not be as difficult to do as I'm worried about, but I'm holding off on that because I know the stuff's online now. So I'm not tinkering with it yet. And if somebody wants to help me on a tutorial, presumably after the holidays, please let me know on that. But at the moment, I'm doing what I can with the things that are available and proceeding accordingly and juggling all my little balls in the air and all the other stuff. So let us do the, as usual, RJ has to hunt around for his screen share button. And then, whee, the infinite regress. There's our patrons, and they are getting bigger. So we've got Stephen and Marigale and Keith and Dyer and Andrew and Eatmeal and Yui and Mona and Hendrel and Jen and Jody and Brad and Daniel Johnson and Ralph McFadden and Meet Convert Me and Nyanya and Bo Holbo and Palogia. Thank you, Palogia. And Eric Rowley and Benjamin Simpson and Staggles and Alex Stone and Sun Sky Stone and Surus, who is again helping me with the audiobook project, and Totes Real and Everett and Sewer and Paul Williams. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you all. Behold and partake of tip at my website, tortucan.wordpress.com. And if things work out, maybe the Patreon will look brighter and brighter. That all of these people who have helped out so generously will actually have helped out generously at my end too. And there's also the GoFundMe that can be used for quickie donations, although you can do sustaining things there, recurring things there. If you like think, oh, $5 a month, I could spare that. You could do that. That's absolutely perfect. And I'm hoping to get a nice broad field of people who recognize the importance of the project. I'll stop my little sharing here now. To tell people about what I'm up to. I'm doing something that nobody has done before, which is I kind of stumbled into it because I was tracking the anti-evolution field and writing up why they were wrong and looking up the primary sources, and my data field got bigger and bigger and bigger. I think I've got something in the neighborhood of 57,000 sources in my bibliography at the moment, of which some 25,000 are technical papers and almost 9,000 anti-evolution works. That's a lot. And I realized that I could also track something. If I just notched up one level more, I can track all primary source technical citation that any anti-evolutionist has done. So Andrew Snelling might have 50, 80, 100 citations in a technical paper. And of those, some of them are creationist sources, but the vast majority are technical papers. And I will track down every single one of them, not merely the obvious ones where he's misrepresenting source material, but just even the obvious, the trivial ones where he's just citing something nobody's disagreeing with, like a rock is there, kind of thing. And that means what I'm doing now is producing an absolute measure of the entire field of anti-evolution source citation. This is their full data field. And at the moment, it's about 4,000 sources. Well, I just told you I have 25,000 technical papers in my bibliography. That means they're 4,000 plus another 21,000. So they're bumping into about 15% of my data field. Now, my data field is a floor, not a ceiling. I do not for a moment think I've got the full skivvy. I've just found a lot of material to track down the context for that. Their 4,000 is a ceiling, not a floor. Because as I've been demonstrating with the Contested Bones book, that a big chunk of their material, in their case, 40%, is just authority quoting. So if I'm generous and saying that a chunk of their material, of their 4,000, isn't really primary source, it's secondarily quoted or it's for authority quoting, and my 25,000 is just a portion of the whole data field, I'm using as a rough heuristic that anti-evolutionists are missing 90% of the data field. This is not a guess. This is a practical measurement of what is actually found. And in some areas, as you'll see from reading Evolution Slam Dunk, plug, plug, that anti-evolutionists are missing all of the data field. That literally only one creationist in the entire bunch, 20 people, out of 20 people who've even bumped into the reptile-mammal transition, out of 2,400 anti-evolutionists that I track, Only one, Duane Gish, even tried to kind of sort of explain that double jaw matter. And that was back in his 1995 book. That's only one. Krieger, as you know, from Creation Wiki, had the gall to mention the probanognaathids in his litany, but didn't actually discuss any of the contents of them.
RJ, they're 100% mammals or reptiles.
Yeah, they're perfectly normal mammal with a jaw form that no living mammal is known to have, but is tracked in the fossils in that particular form and was literally predicted by evolutionists, but never by creationists. Yeah, it's just perfectly normal mammal. Yeah. And so I want to put the probanognaathids on the field, and I want to put the reptile mammal transition on the field because it's such a spectacular example of macroevolution with none of the little fiddly holes that you find with some areas. Whenever you're bringing up the Cambrian explosion, you're bumping into fossil limitations. The fact that half of the animal phyla don't have a fossil record at all, let alone going back to the Cambrian. And with birds, you still have the fact that the early Jurassic period is not well known for small theropods and therefore small protobirds. And so you've got a kind of a hole before you get to Archaeopteryx, or that, I can never remember the name of the taxon, but it's the one that was found in China that apparently dates back into Archaeopteryx.
Oh, Xiaotingia?
Yeah. And see, there it is. He knows these things. But that you still have some murkiness involved with things. By the way, I'm going to be discussing a little later on in one of the later evolution hours, but Denise O'Leary shot her mouth off on that new pterosaur feather find or feather-like filament find, and she's going, see, feathers are dating back 70 million years before the ones in the birds.
Uh-oh.
No, not quite. And you're missing the point as usual, and she was relying on a secondary source to get to it. I mean, it's usual, Denise O'Leary. If you're not familiar with Denise.
There have been some researchers arguing for a while now, I think mostly out of China, that pterosaurs had the pycnofibers are actually homologous to later feathers, which may or may not be the case.
Yeah. And the new paper offers some further evidence of that. Benton is one of the co-authors. Unwin, who is one of the big pterosaur researchers, is skeptical. He thinks that they're just the filaments that form because they had like a hairy integument. They had like a furry thing. And it wouldn't surprise me that the underlying genetic systems of those are relatively comparable. But this pushes that integument system fraying keratin fiber thing farther back in the archosaurs, which doesn't surprise me at all. And the fact that we're showing up in a lot of different areas, the paleogenomics of 2118 are going to blow your socks off. I won't be there to see it, but there will come a time because they're getting more and more advanced and sophisticated in their analysis, and it'll be more information for creationists to ignore, which they do ever so well. Let me see. I think I can close that little poopy thing down there. Get another. I have to minimize the number of things I have on my computer running at a time. Otherwise, there's the risk of the dreaded roboting, which we don't want to have happen. But by and large, I've been pretty lucky. I think I had only a couple glitch ups in some of my earlier feeds that were a problem. And once I learned some of the skills, Peter, who did my opening logo thing, advised me about the need to shut down Windows to make sure that I had the minimum stuff going. Oh, Beej, as was there ever dinosaurs found where the Aika stones were faked? Not a lot. Peru, for those of you unfamiliar with the Aika stones, these are these little rocks that have all these cute little incised pictures of brontosaurs and stuff
entirely fraudulent.
Yeah, and entirely fraudulent. There was suspicion about them at the time. There's pottery fragments. There's a guy that turns out these little sculptures of things that they're pretty flimsy. In fact, that there are dinosaur fossils known in South America, but not necessarily anywhere in the areas that are involved. In fact, you're much more likely up in Peru to be running into fossils of whales because at the time that the archaeocetes were swimming around, they were the first global whale. The Andes didn't exist. And so it was beachfront property. And that stuff gets eventually smushed up in the Andes mountain ranges in the same way that we find
out of Brazil and Argentina, though.
Yeah, well, yeah, down in there, the Issaquah-Losto formation is one of the biggies for both dinosaurs and transitional mammaliaformes, and that would be back in the Triassic. But yeah, they're not sitting on. Let's put it this way: they're not sitting on dinosaur deposits, particularly up there in that much more recent geological frame.
You also, even among creationists, most of the major organizations don't believe the Aika stones are real, and of the ones who do think they're real, they ignore some of them, like the ones that have cockatrices on them and things like that. And
it's much more likely that I think there have been some analyses done on what the images look like, that the pictures on the stones of dinosaurs are the kinds of depictions of dinosaurs as they were back in books in the 1950s and 60s. They're not the way we perceive things, like the typical tail dragging dinosaur, bipedal a bit. That's the old version. And so they're portraying the things. It's like if you were doing carving something in about, oh, this giant ape and it's holding a girl in his hand. Yeah, because they saw King Kong. That's how it works out. In the same way that when aliens began to be depicted as puffy gray things with little almond-shaped eyes, that's how they started to be depicted in a lot of secondary material. So the culture tropes this stuff. Our notions of what Loch Ness Monster is partly related to that. The fact that the one fake in regarding the Loch Ness Monster was based on the way they saw creatures in the King Kong movie at the same period. So these things feed back on themselves in woo-woo land. That's very, very different than what's actually there in reality. Yeah, the Beecham says, I'm wondering, because if there wasn't, why is that argument not used against the Aika stones nonsense? Well, it's probably because they didn't think about it. There are a lot of really important apologetic arguments that you can make that don't often get used, and instead they go racing off. Apologists often can be just as superficial as the people they're criticizing, that they will have read a website account of something and there it is, and then they repeat that. But the more you get into the details of stuff, yeah, it's that, what did you stop to notice? One of the questions I like to ask creationists all the time, the young earth flood geology types, is just tell me what the flood layer looks like where you live. It's a global flood. There should be a flood layer where you live. It's like global. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to go to the Grand Canyon. You don't have to find a Lewis overthrust or a polystrate fossils in Yellowstone. You can walk outside and theoretically find the alleged flood.
We pointed that out in my debate with Kent Hovind.
Yeah, well, and in his thing that we were watching on that Mel project stuff, Kent was still repeating the nonsense that fossil graveyards with oodles of fossils all crammed together are common in the fossil record. Oh, no, they're not. And if anybody who's read paleontology and looks through the actual papers will know, those are so rare on Earth. They pop out the champagne corks, because paleontologists just love it if some tidal wave or pyroclastic flow mushes a whole bunch of animals, a herd of animals together, and kills them off. One of the ones I remember, and I discussed this in Dinomania. Remember Dinomania? Everybody download Dinomania, please. It's got a bunch of stuff on flood geology, even though I've written it now like 15 years ago. It's still got a ton of stuff in there. And Richard Milton, the wackaloon British functional young earth creationist nitwit, had cribbed a bunch of stuff from young earth creationist Henry Morris. And I tracked down all the deposits. I was able to get data on every single one of them. One of the ones that was this catastrophic deposition, it's about the size of my house lot. It's like about 70 or 80 feet by about 40 or 50 feet. And there's a bunch of coelophysids that got caught in there in a flash flood. And paleontologists love that kind of stuff, because you get to see not an isolated animal, but a family of animals, a population of animals. So now you get to see what variations there are, how much natural variation is occurring in that population. And surprise, surprise, it looks like there's the same range of variation that you would find in living organisms if you looked at a herd of wildebeests, that they're not all absolutely identical. There's a lot of variation going on. And so that helps us get a measurement about what things are going on. Oh, one of the things that you'll discover at the tail end of the chapter 4, when you get to the finish on that, is a paper that I pulled up from Nathaniel Jensen, who decided to weigh in. No, Jeffrey Tompkins. Jeffrey Tompkins decided to weigh in on that Sanford deterioration of things since Noah's time, and how everything's been falling apart in the human species, and how he apparently forgot that we have DNA from actual archaic humans now.
I remember that, yeah.
And so that, he didn't think to look, even though he's writing decades after this information is coming online. He relied on an old 1997 piece. And that the data doesn't fit his model, and it refutes genetic entropy. Dun, 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 yeah. News bulletin.
Yeah, I mean, as you saw, well, we do mention paleogenomic data rather briefly in that chapter, although we also mentioned paleogenomic data for elephants in chapter 3.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's quite a bit of paleogenomic data that just isn't accounted for. I actually looked up paleogenomic data or paleogenomics on Answers in Genesis. They had one article, which was by Georgia Purdom on Neanderthals.
And the intelligent design one is in the same field. They can go so far as to snark at the Columbine monkey data and that sort of thing. But the field has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I mentioned a chunk of it in Slam Dunk. Another reason to get Slam Dunk, gang. About the tooth reconstructions that they retro-engineered all the little cusp forms that are found on mammal teeth. And this was going back all the way like 100 million years, because they recreated with just a couple tweaks of 2 genes. They were able to recreate a tooth form that's extinct. That's in an ancient form that's a totally extinct lineage. I think I call it the T2 in the book because the names are so similar. Remember, I'm a clod too, so I find little cues in the way that I write so that somebody who's not technically refined will be able to follow along, because there was this one group, I think one's called the Tritylodontids, and then there's another one that has a name that's really similar. So I call them T1 and T2. Yeah. And so that allows you to kind of keep track of them, because if I can get confused on it, same thing with ants. When I brought up, oh God, some of those little ant names, your eyes are going to glaze over. And sometimes it's just literally the tiny spelling that one is spelled with an A and one is spelled with an IE or something like that. And you've got a totally different family of ants under that circumstance. So, it's easily confused. And I wrote the book in such a way that it would make it as open for people who were not technically skilled to go through it. But if you are technically skilled, you're not going to feel like, well, boy, this is a dumbed down book. No, that's what those little paragraphs with the references are in there for, so that it's far from that. And impress Christine Janis, that when a working paleontologist finds no problems with the book, that's a little bit of a backpack there. I did that pretty well. And there will not be an Evolution Hour next week because of the holiday, but we'll be back in January 2019. Ta-da! And then on the 16th, Matthew Herron is going to be guest on the show, and we're going to be discussing, if you can be available for that, Jackson. I think that would be delightful. Hopefully, you won't have a class then or work. But anyway, I'll be putting a link up to his brand new paper that just came out, and of course, hopefully, we'll be discussing Volvox and more of his merry interactions with intelligent designers, and we'll be having a lot of fun, I think, on that, because you had a really great chat with him, and I think we'll have a nice discussion on our show as well. So, and let everybody know about that. And for 2019, if anybody has a place that needs an old fart to lecture on issues of creation evolution, I'm available. I can do it on Skype, or I can do it physical if you can pay my way there. I'm open to these things. I've then schedule, and so forth and so on. So we'll see how things are working out in 2019, plugging away with the new book and all the new projects. Then there was the other material that I had. I forgot that there was an Act 3. Creationists and Mantle slabs. A creationist online, or no, I think it was on Facebook. He brought up the supposedly mysterious Mantle slabs that were not cooling properly if they were only if they were billions of years old or millions of years old. And so he linked to this piece by Clary, who is one of the allegedly technically proficient people at the Institute for Creation Research. And so I looked into that little one and put up 2 papers, one of which he cited and another more recent one that also explains beautifully why this is not a problem. That in fact, these mantle slabs will have particular constituents in them that act as heat sinks, so that they warm up at the periphery, but they stay relatively cool in their little cores. And so they're like little blobs that are sinking down into the mantle, and they remain relatively homogeneous over particular times. And there's absolutely nothing about this that is contradictory with regular plate tectonics and geology or ancient age of things. And nothing the creationists presented offered any indication of this. It all had to do with a peroxylene or some such thing. There was a particular kind of rock deposit that has these thermal properties that are very different from ones that don't. And so, ta-da, you know, it's all physics. And surprise, surprise, the creationist didn't know about that in his paper. And surprise, 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 the secondary redactor on Facebook never thought to fact check.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Are we getting a pattern here, Jackson, you think?
I think, you know what they say, what is it? 1 is an anomaly, 2 is a trend.
Yeah, and 100% is like 100%. That you discover that this is not an isolated phenomenon. It occurs all across the spectrum, and all from bottom feeders like Kent Hovind all the way up to Andrew Snelling and Georgia Purdom and Jeffrey Tompkins and the gang up at the upper echelon of Antievolutionism and creationism.
I thought it was funny how when we did our talk with Giant Midget, Steve McRae asked if there was one thing you could ask Georgia Purdom, what would it be? Explain notothenoid antifreeze genes. She can do that and put it within a creationist context and convince other geneticists I'll become a creationist.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know the skivvy on it, there are a bunch of different fish that have independently developed antifreeze proteins. And what Purdom did, and I think Ann Gager and others who have waded into this area as well, have been very selective about which ones they discuss.
They don't talk about notothenoids, though.
They avoid the fish where it's clearly the case of an entirely new function coming from a completely different gene that just flips and accidentally has a new property, and that allows the fish to expand into new areas that they wouldn't before. So there's a bunch of different ways for this to kind of happen. The one thing that I try to hammer in at people, among all the many things that I try to hammer into people, is the idea there's rarely a single thing. That most biological processes involve lots of different ways to the same thing, and nature, being relentlessly unconcerned with the things in between, can have things happen, and it will happen eventually. So multicellularity looks like something that pops up all the time. Oh, go jump in.
Oh, I was quoting Malcolm from Jurassic Park. Life finds a way.
Yeah. That it's sort of the reverse of the what's the thing where if anything could go wrong, it will. I've forgotten the term for it, but it's that if anything can happen, it probably will if you give it long enough time. The thing that's revealing, if you have a good map of time, is that there was no immediate jump to multicellularity. But there seems to be a multiple range of things that can develop multicellularity. And that's even within our particular selected range. We don't know how many potential others didn't make the cut that also have adaptive landscapes that are available to them. We just don't know enough about that. We can only go on the life forms that we have existing. And so you can retro-calculate LUCA, which is based on living life forms. But we can't tell how much range beyond that. As a working hypothesis, I treat LUCA as probably the natural outcome. That's probably the system that works well. And we can see the same phenomenon happening in the Cambrian explosion, because initially there's a proliferation of bug forms. A lot of the taxa already probably existed. We know mollusks are appearing very early with the small shelly fauna before the big Cambrian explosion part. We can't be certain of how far back the little chordates are, but the chordates we find there are exactly what evolution was suggesting they would be, like lamprey larvae. I mean, this isn't a shock. But the things that are, the forms that are invisible without a Lagerstätten are these proliferation of little buggy forms. I think some McMenamin, I think, called it a parts store for arthropods. That there's just just an incredible mixture of biramus appendages, you know, all these different critters, the vast majority of which never survived the Cambrian. Now, did they fail to survive because they just had the luck of the draw, or because they lacked some evolvability potentials that their counterparts didn't? So trilobites made the cut, and the chelicerates made the cut, and the ones that led off to the conventional insects made the cut. And as we know from the insects, boy, what a prolific bunch they are. To this day.
Some of the first animals on land, after all.
Yeah, and they're also some of the most resilient. I think the Permian is about the only mass extinction that really put a dent in insects. Not as badly as everybody else, but it really took that. Puffaluffagus says, James Down at Ask a Creationist how Cavidae got to the Americas. You're talking about biogeography and have a creationist give a biogeographical explanation? Tee-hee.
Oh yeah, the one of the porcupines is a caviomorph, because you have the one group of porcupines in Africa who are the true porcupines, and then you have a caviomorph that independently became a porcupine, which is was Erethozontidae or something like that. I can't remember which one it is, but yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, Beach is impressed that BJ is impressed that some trilobites made it through 3 extinctions. Yeah, they lasted a long time. If you just stack up the amount of time frame involved and their enormous diversity. Niles Eldritch is a trilobite guy, and he's written books with illustrations. And you go through trilobites, and you're just gobsmacked. I mean, they all look trilobite-y in the same way that all vertebrates look vertebrate-y. But nonetheless, they've got so many variations and some of these incredible little spines and squiggles and coming out. Then, of course, the ones that developed those hexachroral eyes, those very complicated eye bits, one group developed those. And I discussed those a little bit in Dinomania. Download that damn chapter. I got a lot of crap in that. It was either in that or creationism. Download everything I've written, damn it. And read the PDFs and all that, because there's an awful lot of stuff in there, and it'll get you up to speed on a lot of material. It's not that I'm the oracle that has everything, but I've got a lot of stuff in there that I'm very proud of, and I still think holds up really well. That you'll have some different twists. So you'll go, oh, I hadn't really thought about it that way before. And there we go. So the trilobites lasted an awful long way. Ammonites lasted a long while. They were starting to show up. I can't remember whether they were only in the Ordovician, but anyway, they made it down through the Permian, and then that was the end of it. But Permian was such a disaster for aquatic life in general, and it also impacted heavily on the critters in the land animals. I mean, only one family of therapsids made it through the Permian mass extinction. It was that narrow a window. Fortunately, that was enough, and it led to us. And then there's also the issue of how much mass extinctions act as deck clearers that basically empty the bathtub, and the stragglers that survive then have a chance to proliferate and then eventually refill the bathtub. This is an analogy that I used, I think, in one of the chapters, that if everything is a design theme park, how come the delay? Why so long to refill the bathtub? Why so long to refill ecological niches? Sometimes these rebounds in individual groupings can take 10, 20 million years. Boy, that's slow. Well, if the only thing you have to work with is what survives, and you don't have a magic designer coming in making new stuff, then that accounts for it. That's why mass extinctions have these pulses, and that you have a rebound time. And the Cambrian is what looks like the rebound pulse following the Ediacara mass extinction. There was a whole ecosystem that fell apart, and some stragglers made it through, and then the early groups take over. There's a period in the earliest phase, the Manichaean phase, where there's almost nothing but Claudina and what? Something that eats them, bores holes in them. What is it? We don't know, because they're no Lagerstätten deposits. But there's a whole new ecosystem that's presumably the remnants of what was left over from the Ediacara. If we had Lagerstätten, we could tell more about it. And then the small shelly fauna start kicking in, and they dominate the field. Those are these little mollusks. Well, why do you need shells? Again, presumably something around will eat you if you don't have a shell. So there's a selection pressure for shells. We don't know what those are. And then third pulse is where we find this proliferation of arthropods. If we add more Lagerstätten earlier, we might find that even some of the pulses that we're seeing in the Cambrian explosion aren't quite so explosive as before, but we don't have any Lagerstätten earlier than that. And all the Lagerstätten we have are on the equatorial, tropical.
Now, jump in. Phylogenetics has come in and kind of filled in a few of the gaps, is because it seemed like, you know, you had the Cambrian, then all of a sudden, boom, there everything is. But when the genetics comes into the play, you realize most of the common ancestors lived in the late Precambrian. Like, heck, our common ancestor with echinoderms was, I think, like the last common ancestor before we actually cross over into the Cambrian.
And so it's making predictions about what you would find if you could get in the Wayback Machine, or if you can find a Lagerstätten. And generally speaking, but a thing that another point that you get in is that the genetic data will always precede the fossils. That you're seeing the genetic switches that they're measuring in living forms 500 million years away, that those deep roots are going to be switching in forms that won't look at all like what they look like now. And so the changing morphology is going to be tracking after the genetic switches, not before. Duh. So this doesn't surprise me at all. Puffalophagus puts up a thing. I wonder if you could get them, creationists, to trap themselves into admitting that Cavidae rafted to the Americas and that they did what Noah did with no divine inspiration. Well, there's a whole bit, because supposedly there are these gigantic floating forests that were existing, according to some creationists. Kurt Wise likes to play with those, that instantly got flash mushed into coal deposits. And it's a weird world of the pre-flood and flood world and post-flood world. It's like the kind of thing that needs to be made by a special effects team that has more technical skill than knowledge, so that they can just come up with things that look really cool that don't really make
tornadoes.
Sense. The tornadoes in that Genesis movie. Yes, they're wisping around as God whooshes things together and makes strange little animals that nobody knows in nature. But yeah, that's an interesting biogeography. Is always a fun thing. There's always anti-evolutionist Gunter Beckley was prattling on about biogeography in his posts in that video that I was discussing earlier. We still don't know exactly how the very earliest New World monkeys made it here. Of course, they weren't monkeys like what we're used to. They're little itty bitty things. They're more like the size of almost a mouse.
We're closer together, you know.
A little bit across, not a great deal, because we're talking about 50 million years ago. My personal view is that they came the Asiatic route. They didn't come across from Africa.
I think,
my suspicion is that, and that means there must have been a bunch of these that have not been tracked in the fossil record yet. But remember, they're so bloody small that the odds of finding them are fairly remote. But there's some analyses that have looked at the Asiatic side and how land bridges were forming, and that there was in fact a route down that is theoretically possible. But I don't preclude some rafting across there. There are some island chains that were apparently on the surface during the period that might have been bridges in this area. And you'd have to look at paleo currents and another little thing. But remember, they're very small animals. They're not right. One of the intelligent design things had a parody of Titanic, where they had these two chimpanzees standing on the front of the Titanic, and that this was the idea of them rafting across the ocean. No, these are animals small enough to hold in your hand. The early primates are not big. And so the fact that they weren't looking at what the actual animals were involved, animals that were so small that a floating raft of a set of a tree with some shrubbery that collapses and wafts along can carry a whole family of those little critters in that little teeny niche, because they're that small. Now, that's not going to happen very often. But remember, the distributions are such they don't need to happen very often. They only need to happen occasionally. And so when you have a millions of year time frame to play in, what are the odds that occasionals are going to happen?
Yeah.
So we'll see how far the anti-evolutionists do. And of course, what is their explanation? Zot? We don't really know what their explanation is for why the animals are there at all. Let's see, what have I got? Keep an eye on over here. People are talking about name changes about something, so I won't go into that one. Another reason for downloading Dynamania is I have a big section in there about Noah's Ark and the flood and the old Babylonian flood tales. The one area that I would be revising a bit is a slight caveat on the Black Sea flooding, that there's still some genuine back and forth about how severe it was and if it involved a water drop edge and all this kind of stuff. There's a delicious fist fight that's going on to this day between the Pittman camp and a small body of critics, and that may be a clue that it's a relatively small body of ones. At least we can argue that if there was a major sea flooding up in the Black Sea, that it contributes to some of the deep details of an inundation story. But the vast majority of the stuff that is related to the flood is coming from the Babylonian, Mesopotamian myths. And you need to find out, because everybody mentions Gilgamesh, but let's not forget Atrahasis and the other bunch, that those stories are just hilarious. There was a wonderful book by Cohn that I drew on that did as beautiful a depiction of the essence of these tales, and also why it figures in later lore, that it was a story that they latched onto, the Jews, in a traumatic period during the Babylonian captivity when they thought God had forsaken them. And the idea of an inscrutable mystery God that gets pissed off with how people are behaving and kills off just about everybody in a fit, and didn't really have to explain it to anybody. Excuse me, I'm God, I can do what I want. And, think of Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Just back off. That kind of attitude is understandable given the traumatic experience that they went through in the Babylonian captivity. And I've been slowly gathering, I'm frustrated, ironically, by the fact that so much of the literature on mythology and archaeology stuff isn't as accessible online as science stuff is. And so sometimes it's really hard to track down some of these papers and that, but I'm slowly penning my way through and glomming onto stuff in the literature in there, and maybe I'll live long enough to be able to deal with it. Well, we are well past our little hour here. And are there any final questions from the gallery out in there? If so, if not, then we'll pull up the gangplank here, and we'll be seeing you in 2 weeks. And I wish, as an atheist, I wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy Hanukkah and a Fröhliche Weihnachts if you are auf Deutsch, and don't get taken by Krampus. And make sure that your winter solstice is a happy one, and don't eat any wooden penguins. And I think that pretty much covers it. and oh yes, and get Evolution Slam Dunk and the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg as that perfect Christmas stocking stuffer at the very last minute. Amazon.com rush a mail to you. Okay, well. Yes, and Feliz Navidad. Yes. And I'll be breaking into Christmas carols here if we do not watch out. Pavlovicus did ask last, what is the current state of Raptor Rex? I don't know. Are you familiar with that off the cuff, Jackson?
It is uncertain because Raptor Rex was discovered by essentially fossil poachers, and so they don't know what the original strata for it was. So it might be a baby Tarbosaurus, or it might be its own species, but a juvenile. Yeah. So that is currently up in the air.
That would be understandable. That whenever we know enough about animal taxonomy to know that, particularly if it's not a professional paleontologist, that trying to look at it from afar, you need to be able to look at it in precision. And you need to be able to now do detailed analyses of bone histology and others to try to figure out what you're looking at. Is an adult or is it a juvenile of something else? And if so, what? So, yeah, so I'll defer to Jackson there. Wait for the dust to settle. Okay, BJ and Nim and Old Scratch and Puffaluffagus, and tell everybody about the project, and see you in 2019. Wow.